In this tutorial, we're going to make a leather leaf pack. As you all probably know by now, we get started by printing out the digital pattern. The front page has everything that you need to keep track of what's in your pattern. A title, an image, I'm out of magenta ink, it looks like garbage, our recommended hardware, and an overview of all the pieces included with basic labels. This is a pretty big pattern with a lot of pieces, so I've done my best to keep the labeling simple and straightforward. This is the back of the bag labeled A, and you can match it up using the pattern overview here. Everything that is the back will have a small A on it, and you'll know that they go together. The same goes for the sides of the backpacks and the other pieces as well. Cut out your pattern pieces using a simple pair of scissors. Make sure you're not cutting directly on the line of the pattern piece. You want to leave a small gap like I'm showing here. Once your pieces are cut out, you'll want to assemble the larger pieces into one. I like to use clear tape. I'll leave one side of the pattern longer, and I will cut the other piece on the line directly so that I can line them up like this. Keep doing this process until you have all of your pieces completed. I don't usually show this part of the process, but because there's a lot of stitching involved in this one that we're going to blaze through kind of fast, I figured I'd give you an idea of what it looks like when I'm trying to lay out leather pieces on a hide. The cat you see there is my cat Kiwa. She's supervising. But basically, I try to lay out everything so that I'm using up as little space as possible. And then I go over all of my edges with a crappy masking tape. I use this masking tape, as you probably know by now if you've seen my other videos, because I can see through it really well, which helps me when I'm punching holes later. For the most part, you can see that I'm keeping everything pretty close together. There's exceptions, and that typically has to do with where the leather is thickest, which is going to be in the middle of the hide, and also any kinds of imperfections that might be there that I don't want to be on the final product. So I will scooch things around. For example, you can see there's a hole there that I avoided, so that I don't have any ugly scratches or marks that the animal experienced in its life showing on the final product. All the straps for this bag are 1 inch wide. These are primarily a guide for punching holes. To cut them, I use a strap cutter, which looks like this. It's got a handle, an adjustable bit at the top for tension, and then this sort of measuring tool on the bottom. And there's a little blade in between these here. You use these to set the length, or the width rather, of your strap, and pretend my hand is leather. As you pull it through, you'll get a strap cut perfectly straight by the tool. You can also use scissors or a box cutter or something like that, but these strap tools are really great. You can see how nice and even these straps are that I cut with it. You can lay the pattern piece on top and mark out the holes that you need to punch, and then you'll be good to go. Now that we have everything taped and cut out, it is time to punch our holes. We have 2 sizes that we're going to use for most of my patterns, a 1.5mm round punch and a 3mm round punch. And there's only a couple holes we need to punch here, so let's get started. Punching holes is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to dive too hard into that. You get better at it by practicing, and you figure out how hard you need to hit. It's largely based on the thickness of your leather and just making sure you're accurate and as aligned straight up and down as possible. What I do want to point out though is you may notice how around the edge of my pattern here, not only do I have a gap from the outer line of the pattern to the edge of where I cut it, but there's also a gap in the leather. This is really important for making sure your shapes stay correct, and you'll see why when I cut out this piece later. It's basically a shortcut so that we don't have to actually trace anything over onto our leather. Okay, we did it. We punched all the holes. Here's a small piece. This is one of the pieces that goes on the bottom of the bag to hold a D-ring. And now I am cutting right along that actual line, that outer line on the pattern piece that I was talking about. And now when I pull away this pattern paper, you can see I have a beautifully cut piece of leather with clean edges, no marks, no drawings, no dots, ready to go. This next bit is optional. This is something that I do to mark everything I work on. I always try to find a spot to put my little maker stamp. This is a perfect spot right here on the upper back of the bag. If you want to add something like that, you can carve it, you can stamp it like I'm doing. You can use a hot branding iron. It's totally up to you. But I think it's important to have a way to mark your work. It's kind of like a maker's tag or logo on a piece of clothing. I like to put it on the back here so that it's not super obvious and in the way, but it's still there. I can tell that it's something that I made. It's just a little point of pride. But you can put whatever you want here. You can put nothing at all. It's totally up to you. I have a 1-ton Arbor Press that you can see here that I use to press the brass stamp into damp leather. There's all kinds of places on Etsy where you can order a custom stamp. That's where I got mine. I will probably have a link down in the description below if you would like to see where I got it. But it's a super simple process and it just looks kind of nice. We are almost to the point where we can start adding color, but first we have some details to put on these leafy parts of the Leafpack. I'm going to show you how to do that with the pockets because they're little. I start by getting the leather damp. This is just a basic sponge that you can buy from most leatherworking shops or any craft store, really. You don't need to go crazy with the water here. It doesn't need to be super saturated. You can see how the leather is still absorbing it very quickly. This is a pencil that I use. I can't remember the name of it. I think it's by Conte Paris or something like that. But it's kind of like a pastel pencil almost. It's very soft. And I like to use this to draw out or sketch out my design before I go in with a swivel knife. That way I kind of have a plan going in, I'm not going in blind, and I have a little bit of a line to follow. I like this pencil because I can wipe it out pretty easily if I need to while the leather's quite damp, and it only really leaves a mark while the leather is damp, and in the process of carving and staining, these marks just completely go away. It's a little bit like a sewing pencil. I will try to figure out what it's called and link it down below for you. I think I've linked it in another video before. This tool's called a swivel knife. I talk about it in a little more detail in other videos, which you can see linked above. I've got a ceramic blade on here. Most are metal and kind of a rectangular shape. This angle I find easier for doing details, but that saddle that's on my finger there is the rotation point, and that essentially allows you to create nice, continuous, smooth lines, which you'll see me doing in just a moment. You'll notice that the pattern pieces for this backpack do not have lines on them for this leaf pattern. That's because I freehand design these patterns every single time, so every bag that I make is a little bit unique. You can make whatever patterns you want on here, you can leave them completely blank. I thought it would be more fun if people could decide which type of leaf they want to base these on, if there's something else that they want to carve into these. I like to leave things a little bit open so that you're not stuck all just making the exact same bag that everyone else has. Once our lines are cut, we can go in with this stamp tool. This is I think it's a notched or hatched beveling tool. You can see it's got a little bit of a texture on it. I like this over the smooth ones. That's just personal preference. There's all different kinds of patterns that you can choose to do. You can leave your tooled lines like this if you want this sort of simple thin line. I like to come in with a beveling tool like this, and you'll see why in a moment. This is effectively leather shading. You can do an amazing amount of detail and add a ton of depth just by using these beveling and stamp tools. Doesn't this look super cool? It gives a little bit of texture around those edges. It creates a bit of depth that makes that leaf sort of spine stand out from the rest of it. I like to go in and do that on all the edges of the leaf patterns so that it looks like this. It's, again, completely up to you if this is something that you want to add. I think it looks really, really nice, and it's just an extra bit of contrast that's really, really worth it. We can finally add some color! I'm using my favorite EcoFlow Gel Antique in a dark brown. I talk about this stain and why I like it in other videos and also showcase the process, so you can check that out. There's a link in the top right corner, so I'm not going to talk about it in a ton of detail. Basically, you slather it on, you wipe it off, and it looks great. That's kind of all there is to it. It's pretty user-friendly, that's part of why I like it. It does not work well for getting into small spaces or details or trying to do small, thin borders, things like that. But for coverage and just getting a really nice color, great, I love it. The color scheme for these bags is totally up to you. Generally, I like to do basic leather colors for the non-leafy parts and leafy colors for the leafy parts. But you could also do weird colors like bright purple or pink or whatever floats your little leafy boat. This is a bit that I always forget to show in my tutorials. This is golden mink oil. It's basically a leather conditioner that also does a bit of waterproofing, and I like to apply it while the dye is still a little bit damp. I find it dries together really, really nicely and creates a really good cohesive finish. Similar process to the Gel Antique. You take a bit on a cloth, buff it on, wipe off any excess, and then let everything dry completely overnight. This step is super important if you have dye on something that is going to be rubbing up against your body where there might be heat and moisture, say a strap. Getting this finish on the underside of a strap can really save you from having a lot of stains and rub off on your clothing later. Now we're moving on to my favorite part of making these backpacks, which is painting the leaves. I'm going to be using a few different colors of water stain for this. I've got a scarlet, I have this purple, and then I'm also going to use some yellow. The customer for this particular bag asked for a beautiful bright kind of orangey color for the big leaf, and then for the front leaf and the pockets we're doing a sort of burgundy purpley red, so that's what I'm working on here. Mixing your own colors is really helpful when you're doing leather work. It helps you create something that's a little bit more unique, but it can also be challenging if you don't make enough and you don't have it set up so that you can store it easily if you need to use more of it later. That's part of why I'm mixing this color in this little mason jar that has a lid so that if I need to, I can close it up, pick it back up later, and keep using it. And I'm not stuck with just a little bit of color that I then can't really replicate. It's important to test any custom dyes that you make. Make sure the thing you're testing on is from the same hide as the piece you're making. Each hide is tanned differently, so they will react to colors differently. I go through and test a few different swatches before I come to the final color that I like. Once we're ready to stain, I'm just using another basic sponge like I used to apply water earlier. You don't want to apply too much at once, and then I'm also going in kind of a circular motion to try and get as even a coat as possible. You'll typically want to do 1 or 2 coats to make sure you get really intense color, and also to hide any quote-unquote brush strokes that you end up with. Always make sure you're getting your edges as well. Those are easy to forget about, and it just helps make the piece look more professional and finished if you've got everything covered. You can always buff off any excess stain that you have to make sure nothing pools or drips or creates uneven color splotches. Once you have it set up, you can also do the golden mink oil on these pieces as well, and then leave them overnight to dry. Now that everything is stained, we have one more step to do before we can start stitching. There are certain pieces, the back, the sides and their connecting pieces, the front leaf, and the big leaf flap that all need to be lined with fabric before we start stitching. I'll show you that process using one of the smaller pieces so it's a little bit simpler to see. The customer for this backpack requested simple black cotton fabric. I usually recommend a flannel or something of a similar weight because it tends to take adhesive better and is a lot easier to work with. Here I'm tracing out the shape of the piece using just a white gel pen because it's a dark fabric. You can also use a fabric pen or marker or whatever works for you. This is to give me a guideline for where to apply my adhesive. I'll be using this Leathercraft cement from Fibings again. I've used it before in other videos. You can also use things like barge cement, but I find that this water-based adhesive is a little bit easier to apply on fabric and tends to stain it less. So I'm just going to apply it with a foam brush and try to spread it as evenly as possible, paying extra close attention to the edges of this shape. I don't want any of these edges to lift up, especially in places where there isn't going to be any stitching, which we do have a couple that I'll address later. I'll then repeat the process on the actual leather piece, so you want to put glue on the fabric and the piece of leather that is going to stick down to it. Once your glue is applied, you're going to put them together immediately. Unlike barge cement or other contact cements, you want to make sure these go together while they're at least a little bit damp and they will dry together. I like to use a blue shop towel to wipe the piece down and simultaneously push it down into place. This helps get rid of any glue squeeze out between holes and just helps make sure I'm applying even pressure without getting my fingy prints all over the piece. We're going to repeat this process with all those other pieces that need fabric, but there's a couple pieces that need extra steps before we glue the fabric down. For example, the side panel has this little leaf pocket that we stained earlier. That needs to be stitched into place before we glue it down. That way you don't have any stitching lines on the inside of the backpack. It's just nice smooth fabric. The other one that we need to do first is on the front leaf. We have these little D-ring holders. It's a little oblong piece that gets folded in half to hold our D-rings in place, like this. These also need to be stitched into place before we glue it down to fabric so that we don't have any stitching lines on the inside of the bag. Make sure your D-rings are in them when you attach them. They get held on with 2 rivets into these holes here and then stitched into place. Once your glue is dried completely, I will usually wait overnight. You can cut the fabric away from the leather. I typically use my leather shears for this, or fabric scissors, either one works, and I try to get as close to the edge with as clean an edge as possible. Typically holding this at a bit of an angle works best so that you're not accidentally cutting the edge of your leather, you're just cutting away excess fabric. Do this for all your fabric mounted pieces. Now that all of our pieces have fabric on them, they're ready to be stitched together. Something you can do if you want to is take an awl or a similar sharp tool and go ahead and pre-punch fabric inside all of the holes. This helps the stitching process go a little bit more smoothly, and you also have less risk of tearing the fabric, but I actually ended up stitching most of this bag without doing this step, and it worked just fine. A lot of it depends on what fabric you decide to use and how thick it is. Let's start putting this bag together. We have a lot of pieces to go through, so I'm gonna go one step at a time and not show you quite as much of the stitching process because I show you how to do that in other videos. We're gonna focus on the order of operations more so than anything else here. So we're gonna start with, this is the back of the bag and these 2 inside pockets. They get stitched together, one on top of the other with 1 stitch. It's a basic saddle stitch all the way around. I always use the same type of thread and needles, as I've shown you in other videos that I've made previously. When you reach this point as you're stitching your pockets together, you can start adding the second pocket. I use the bottom corner to make sure I know where the next pocket is going to start. And you're just going to stitch straight through first one pocket and then the other and stitch them both to the back of the bag in the same stitch. Once the second pocket is connected, simply keep stitching as normal. This is what the pockets should look like once we're done. You see we have one smaller pocket in the front and then a longer pocket in the back. It's got this nice simple stitching line on the back here, also adds a little bit of stability for the backpack. The next thing we're going to stitch into place is these side panels. But before we stitch them to the actual bag, we're going to add these smaller pieces onto each side panel first. They go on like this. They will eventually go onto the bag in this fashion, and they will fold over to form the sort of side and part of the front of the bag. These 2 pieces will be connected with a cross stitch pattern, which is the same type of stitch that I use for my acorn bag. So if you don't know how to do that stitch, go ahead and check out that video. Once those 2 pieces are stitched together, they can affix to the side of the bag. You can see they'll sit on the bag here like this. This is a frontish panel, that's the top of the bag, and we have our nice pocket right here. They will affix along this side on the inside of the bag like this with a saddle stitch, simple straight saddle stitch just like the pockets. Let's go ahead and get that done. Well done, we now have a beautiful bag butterfly. We're going to add a lower portion to the bag next. You can see we've got our back and sides attached here. They fold inwards to create the sides of the bag. We're going to affix the front leaf now. We've got our D-rings attached already under the fabric, and it's going to affix right along the bottom here, also on the inside of the bag. You will start on those bottom 2 stitches. You will go into those same stitching holes and loop over that same stitch. So we're gonna go straight across, up, and then back across using a basic saddle stitch to affix this leaf. This is the other reason I'm not showing you much of the stitching process, because this thing just keeps getting larger and more ungainly the more pieces we add. But now we have our front leaf affixed. Take care stitching underneath those D-ring holders so you don't stab them and rip the leather accidentally. Our front leaf folds up to form the front of our backpack and will later affix to the sides, but we're going to do a couple things first. The next thing we're going to put onto this bag before we add our leaf lid is the companion piece to the top of the backpack. This piece hides the ugly raw leather underside and also adds some reinforcement to the part that's going to support the majority of the weight of the bag. When you're stitching this in place, we're also going to affix the top straps. They connect inside these 2 pieces like a little Sammy, and they're going to be connected with rivets and then also stitched along the tip. This whole thing comes together with a basic saddle stitch, just like other pieces of the bag. You want to make sure that the top of the strap, the smooth side, is facing upwards when you're doing this, because this is the inside of the bag and then the outside. So this is actually the top piece that we're stitching in place here. I'm trying to move things around to make that make sense to you. Just make sure you have your straps in the correct orientation so you're not accidentally sewing them on upside down. Stitch along these outside holes and ignore those 2 sort of crescent shapes in the middle. Here's where we're at now. You're doing great. We've got our straps attached. We have our front leaf and our lovely side panels with their cute pockets. So now we finally get to affix our lid or flap leaf, which you can kind of see off to the side there. This is going to connect along this double row of holes at the top of our bag here, exactly the same way you attached the front leaf to the bottom of the bag. This leaf is just going to fold over, so you want to make sure you've got the fabric on the same sides when you're stitching. Take your time, one hole at a time, and then we'll do those crescent shapes afterwards. This is, at this point, almost your full backpack mostly assembled. We have a couple more things to do. You can start to see how this is going to come together now with the sides and then the front leaf, the tip of which will tuck into our flap, and that will become a closure. But before that, we are going to attach a handle. This is a new thing in an updated version of this pattern that I am releasing with this tutorial. It's something that people have suggested that I add, and I've found myself wanting one with my own backpack, so that's what these little crescent shapes here are for. Just like the straps, I'm going to recommend that this handle be cut out of a heavier weight leather so that it lasts a little bit longer, and you're just going to affix it with a simple saddle stitch. Now comes the final assembly of this bag. If you can believe it, we only have 2 rows of stitches left. They are long rows, but it's going to be attaching this front leaf all the way up the side. and we're going to affix it along the side of the bag using that same stitch that we used here to connect these two pieces, this cross stitch technique. We're going to do that up both sides to affix them together. This transition here, where you go from the side of the bag to that additional front side piece, can be a little bit awkward. You're going to end up with this little V shape, and that is okay. Once you get past that, keep stitching up the side as normal, and then once you're done with the stitching holes that are available to you on the front leaf, you're going to continue up the side with a regular saddle stitch, and that's just to help keep the fabric in place. Here's what one side looks like all stitched up. It is nice and finished all the way up the side, and it looks beautiful and clean. And then we've got the saddle stitch up along just to finish the top, and that prevents that fabric from pulling away. Go ahead and stitch up that other side, and then we should be good to go. The final piece we need for this bag is the bottom strap component that connects to those D-rings that we attach to the bottom of the bag using these swivel clips, which I quite like. They don't stay in one spot, so it's easy to keep the straps from twisting. The final product looks like this. I've gone ahead and made one of them so that it's easier to see what it will look like, because the way it folds is slightly confusing. We're going to start by folding the strap in half, not at the bottom here, but in this sort of middle set of double holes. That's going to be where our D-ring sits, held in place by a rivet. And don't hammer anything into place yet. I'm just using these to pin things in place, so to speak, just so it all stays in the correct position. We can hammer it all together once it's done. This slot here is for the buckle, but before we put the buckle in, we're actually going to put together the belt catch. This is just a simple little rectangle of leather that holds the excess belt that's not being held by the buckle. We're simply going to put this together with another quick cross stitch, and then it's going to be held in place by 2 rivets so it doesn't wiggle around. Like this. We're going to sandwich this little loop between the bottommost layer of this folded belt thing that we have going on here, and then we can attach the buckle by sliding the pin. The top of the buckle is where that notch is that I just pointed to. We're going to slide that little pin through the loop. Theoretically, it's apparently a little more challenging than it sounds, and then run the rest of the belt through the buckle and fold it over to align with the rest of the rivet holes that we made. Make sure that belt catch is slid up between those 2 holes. I fold it this way so that you have this nice sort of finished edge that's folded over instead of the hard edge that's underneath the buckle. It just looks a little bit nicer and more presentable, and you end up with a strong, sturdy piece that's going to hold your straps really well. Now we can hammer these rivets into place. We can fix these straps on our bags and complete the buckle, and then I think our bag is done. It doesn't matter which of these pieces you buckle to which side, because of that swivel clip, they can attach to either side and always be facing the correct direction. I have these on here so that you can actually have the backpack strap set to the exact length that you want, and then if for some reason you need to remove the straps, or say you have a pair of wings on your back that you want to wear this with, you can unbuckle the strap, pull it over your shoulders, and then fasten it back in place. Hopefully this gives you a little bit more flexibility with how you want to wear this bag. There is one last little step we're gonna do here. You'll notice that there's a little hole on the side of the bag. That is to hold our fastener in place. There's a couple different ways to do this. I do include a pattern to make one out of leather, but I bought these bone spikes from an artist on Etsy that I will link down below. And I really like how smooth and easy they are. I've attached a simple O-ring to it to make it nice and sturdy. I'm just going to attach this to a piece of leather deer hide that I will then tie into the bag to make our little fastener cord. I've cut a little slit in the deer hide strip just to make affixing it to the spike super easy. All we're gonna do is put the slit side through and then pull the rest of the cord through it to make a simple little fastener knot. You can do this with a chain if you prefer. That's also a great option. There's a few different things that you could choose to do here. It's entirely up to you so long as it provides the function that you need. You could also choose to simply not have a fastener at all here and just not punch the hole in the top of the leaf or in the side of the bag. That's also completely up to you if you just want to kind of slot it through that opening in the flap. But all I'm going to do is kind of pinch it to make it fit and slide it with effortless ease that absolutely is not edited in any way, shape, or form, and then we'll tie a knot in the other end to hold it in place. With that, you have completed your very own leaf pack, and it looks fantastic. You did such a great job. This was a super fun project for me to come up with. It was one of the first things I ever made and designed myself as a leather worker, and I've been really wanting to get a tutorial out for you guys, so I'm super excited to have this for you. I forgot to take video for the final shots, so we're gonna have a good old school slideshow. Please enjoy, and thank you so much for watching.